This is the Mankichi Saiko Museum in Kinikawa, and when I first drove into this town, I was expecting to find a monument in front of the home of a man who designed the flag of the Burakumin, Japan's outcast people. These are the untouchables, a forgotten class of discriminated against families, in many cases still living in the outskirts of society. I had no idea I'd discover an entire museum and be set down the path of talking about a struggle for liberation from the caste system. Let us begin, then, a 45-minute drive to the northeast from this museum on the coast to Gose City in Nara Prefecture, passing, on our left, the Kongo Range, which divides Osaka to the north from the communities along the Kinikawa River. Many years ago, the Japanese had social mores established around settling near moving water or in the mountains, as these were off-limits to all but those lower than even the lowest classes in society. Tradition holds that these outcast communities were the children of butchers, undertakers, and leather workers, all jobs needed for society to function normally, but all looked down on as unworthy of company from even the lowest social classes. A slur existed for them, ita, meaning abundance of filth. It was in one of these communities that Mankichi Saiko grew up, on the outskirts of Nara Prefecture, where the Suwaheisha Museum now stands. In the middle of this community stands the Saikoji Temple of the Pure Land School of Buddhism. This school of thought was established by a wise man, Honen, born in 1133. The form of Buddhism was also called Jodo Shu, the goal of which is to reincarnate in a Buddha's pure land, a place where there are no class distinctions, where you can talk directly to Buddha for guidance, a sort of preparation for imminent enlightenment. In Buddhism, there is a belief that practitioners may pass a certain point of non-retrogression, a sort of event horizon after which it's impossible to backslide into lower lots in life through reincarnation. Pure Land Buddhism allows even unethical or outcast people to achieve this and offers a path to the Pure Lands. Even in abject poverty, under enforced social alienation, the outcast instinctively knew that promoting equality would be uplifting on the spiritual level. Mankichi Saiko was an aspiring artist, someone who was just growing into adulthood when riots gripped the country. At the time, he'd had to change schools several times when his status as a burakumin was discovered. And from July to September 1918, demonstrations tore through Japan in an event that became known as the Rice Riots. The upper crust of society were benefiting from the Great War, profiting, as the rich always do, from the suffering of the poor. When the war was over, the price of rice spiked, again lining the pockets of the very wealthy and making the lives of everybody else miserable. More importantly, the newish middle class was deeply affected by the worsening economy, and what began as a protest in a fishing village became the most widespread popular uprising in Japanese history. Upwards of 10 million people participated, including feminists, anarchists, communists, and burakumin who finally saw a way to lash back at an oppressive government who didn't respect their on-paper emancipation. In his hometown, a few men rose to prominence for their role in leading the outcast and protest. These included Mankichi's friends Jichiro Sakamoto and Kisaku Komai. These three men became the face of the Buraku liberation movement in later years thanks to their personal experiences in the popular uprisings of 1918. As for Mankichi's part, he was drawn to radical politics, arguing that leftists and ideologues never judged him. In fact, some radicals even declared that a culture was only as strong as its weakest link. This included communist leader Manabu Sano's special Buraku liberation theory published in 1921. In fact, it was this paper that sparked the formation of the Zenkoku Zuaheisha in March 1922, hereafter called the Levelers Association. This association was in opposition to Teikoku Kodakai, a group of nationalist activists who acknowledged that the Restoration had abolished the caste system and discrimination on paper, but not in reality. The Kodakai argued that all classes were equally children of the emperor. However, perhaps taking some inspiration from their cousins to the west in Russia, the Levelers were formed in 1922 with the argument that all people were created equal, including the emperor. Mankichi Saiko and many other levelers were Buddhists, but drew inspiration from the Christian belief that Jesus died for their sins and that they shouldn't be persecuted for the professions of their distant ancestors. Their name derived from the anarcho-Puritan movement in England some centuries earlier, the Levelers, a group which advocated for total suffrage and equality before God. In Japan, the Levelers prepared to fight for their own emancipation, all while the government told them they already had been freed. They officially announced their formation on March 3, 1922, from Kyoto's Okazaki Public Hall and issued the Sueheisha Declaration. There are still monuments to this declaration around the country, museums and flags displayed for the few American visitors curious enough to seek them out. An impressive monument is found a short walk away from the Sueheisha Museum near the temple that hosted early activists. Konajiro Yamada, a 16-year-old boy with dwarfism, spoke passionately about the feelings of children who were ousted from Japanese society, forced to live in the shadows. One of the events that radicalized burakumin was the Madagahama incident. In March of 1922, 2 months after the formation of the Levelers Association, police in Beppu City were told that Prince Kanin Miyanobu was planning to ride a train through the prefecture in his capacity as president of the Japanese Red Cross. Local police claimed that communist rebels were hiding in the mountains, plotting to derail this train, so they launched a raid on the village of Madagahama, intentionally burning it down. News spread like wildfire through the representatives of the Levelers Association. Rather than a nest of communist revolutionaries, it was in fact a small settlement of mountain people, the so-called Senka, beggars and leprosy patients. By the middle of May 1922, levelers were rallying in town halls across Osaka and Kyoto, so on the 23rd, the Ministry of Interior issued a ridiculous claim saying they weren't burakumin, but simple beggars, and that their homes weren't forcibly burned. The government was now claiming that police calmly explained to them that burning their homes down would improve the public and social good, so they did it themselves. Oddly, these statements did their job. According to some historians, the levelers had a special disdain for the beggar class, and the association, being composed mostly of working-class people, dropped the case and the scandal quietly fizzled out. In any case, these events drew many poor people to the radicalism of the association. In 1923, Mankichi designed the first flag to represent the burakumin, the so-called Crown of Thorns flag. This was used to represent the Sueheisha, a red crown of thorns, symbolic of their suffering and martyrdom, on a field of black, representing a society that still discriminates against them. After the war, this flag was changed to a smaller square in the upper corner on a field of red, representing their revolutionary struggle. A white star was added to the crown, a symbol of their hope for a brighter future. Within a few years, the levelers began to fracture from within. Activists took the view that thorough denunciation of their own discriminators would help to liberate them, but this often went too far and seemed to grow the rift between society and the outcast. Finally, an inner group known as the Bol faction, or Bolshevists, seized the movement because of how many intellectuals had defected over the denouncing of the upper class. It was obvious that the levelers were a strange alliance of communists, right-wingers, and anarchists. Jichiro Matsumoto became chairman in 1926 and declared that denunciation of discrimination at the hands of the military and politicians would continue, taking the form of an alliance with the Labor and Farmers Party. Initially, Mankichi Saiko was in this camp until March 15, 1928. This date went down in history as the March 15 incident. The new government of Japan had passed the Peace Preservation Law, which banned parties which sought to abolish private property. This was aimed at the Communist Party in particular, but also at leftist activists across the country who drew inspiration from the fledgling Soviet Union. On the 15th, police swooped in to arrest 300 people for violating this law, interning them at Ichigaya prison. This included activists for the illegal Second Communist Party, as well as the Farmer Labor Party of Mankichi Saiko and the Japanese Trade Union Council. His time in jail broke Mankichi Saiko. The internment was in some cases fatal. Some who refused to denounce their beliefs were never heard from again. But the hope of the government was that the country's left wing would submit to the divisions they knew were already present in their parties and renounce their convictions on paper. This is exactly what Mankichi Saiko did, and after his release, he shifted to a right-wing splinter of his own Levelers Association. He soon began working with the rival far-right Reconciliation movement and collaborated with the Greater Japan National Socialist Party. Modeled in some ways after fascist movements in Germany and the Young Turks, this party was formed by far-right reformers with branches in China seeking territorial expansion. Saiko felt that this party would recognize that all people were equal under the emperor, rather than the more leftist leveler belief that all men were equal or that the emperor was first among equals. He continued this way until after World War II, after which supposedly he felt great remorse. At that point, Mankichi became a peace activist, opposing nuclear weapons and supporting disarmament, but seldom talked about the burakumin. His life as an artist kept him preoccupied until his death in 1970. But what of the other two men from his hometown in Nara Prefecture, who helped form Zenkoku Suaheisha? Kisaku Komai is pictured to the center of this portrait. Mankichi is on the left. Komai's life was wrought with hardship, and he died soon after the war. Like many burakumin, Komai's family was able to make a decent living performing a specific job, in this case as wood merchants, but they remained social outcasts. Realizing he had the ability to uplift his people, he happily joined his friend Mankichi Saiko. Before the formation of the Levelers Association, they established a social problems research department and started corresponding and visiting intellectuals in Tokyo. The three friends joined the Socialist League shortly before Mankichi traveled to meet Manabu Sano, the communist activist who wrote a report on the liberation strategy of the Buraku people. Inspired by this, Mankichi, Konmai, and others began preparations for the announcement of the Suaheisha. Konmai served on the Central Executive Committee, and he was the one to read the declaration to the burakumin assembled for the event. As already mentioned, the leftist levelers and the right-wing Teikoku Kodakai were clashing over ideology from the moment of the 1922 declaration, and Konami was caught up in this internal conflict. This was known as the Seikoku Incident. On March 17, 1923, an elderly man accosted and insulted a group of burakumin at a wedding in Shimonaga, Nara Prefecture. Two young men approached and told him to leave, so he made insulting hand gestures, holding up four fingers, which incensed the boys. The levelers demanded a public apology, but the old man refused and went to a local construction worker whom he knew was the leader of Dai Nippon Kokusai-kai, a right-wing group of street fighters against socialism. Both groups began antagonizing each other, and police tried to mediate the situation, but it broke down. On the 18th, Kisaku Komai was one of the burakumin who arrived at the Komyoji temple with a sharpened bamboo spear. The right-wing Kokusui-kai assembled at the Kagamisaku shrine with pistols, swords, and crowbars as both factions set up fortifications around town and reinforced themselves with volunteers from outside the local area. Just before 10 a.m., there was a charge against police barriers, and two members of the Suaheisha were slashed with samurai swords. Police intervened to save them, but both sides retreated. The Kokusui-kai congratulated themselves, while the levelers sent out for help all over the Kansai region. Soon, 2,000 leftist allies had arrived with hunting rifles and clubs. Kisaku Komai was there as a leader of the Levelers Association. However, 300 police officers arrived and mediated just as bullets were about to be exchanged, arresting dozens. The leader of the Kokusui-kai was found not guilty, while Komai was sentenced to a year and 3 months in prison for the ordeal because authorities considered him a ringleader of the outcasts. By the time of his release, the Levelers Association was in disarray. He stepped away from the association, deciding to run a parlor in Nara City. A gangster began harassing him over his engagement to a geisha, and he killed the man with a samurai sword in 1932. For this, he was sentenced to 12 years in Kosugi prison. After his parole in 1939, he ran a coffee shop and got married, but died of stomach cancer a few years later. And what of Jichiro Sakamoto, the third of the big three? He lived a full and fascinating life, only passing away in 1987. Much like Komai, his family were very wealthy, well-respected as lenient landlords in the community. They were themselves burakumin and had generational wealth from their glue manufacturing business.
Just behind the Human Rights Park, over this bend in the river, On the right side there was the house of Jichiro Sakamoto after he gained independence from his family. He lived right over there where the new houses are.
Remember, once a family was involved in a business dealing with leather, glue, or similar aspects of death, they could be wealthy, but they would always be outcasts from ordinary society. As early as 1909, Sakamoto organized a group in his hometown called Young People's Republic, a club dedicated to improving the community. After graduating high school in Osaka, he moved to Tokyo and lived in a boarding house with Mankichi Saiko while studying chemistry at the Tokyo School of Technology. These two hometown friends probably felt like they'd entered a new world. They were influenced by thinkers like Hitoshi Yamakawa, a theorist in the field of farmer labor Marxism, and Osugi Sakai, a fascinating anarcho-Christian living at the time with his common-law wife, a radical feminist. This couple got Mankichi Saiko interested in the constructed language of Esperanto, and a few years later they would be assassinated by military police right alongside their 6-year-old nephew. Martyrs for the cause of anarcho-socialism in Japan. Seiichi Sakamoto was the thinker to suggest using the name Suaheisha, or levelers. He let his radical friend Mankichi Saiko take a central role in the association, preferring to take a less crucial position behind the scenes. Like Saiko, he was also swayed to the right after joining the Greater Japan National Socialist Party. Mankichi Saiko never really touched the Buraku issue after the war, and Kisaku Komai died in late 1945. Of the three grandfathers of Buraku activism, only Sakamoto took a post-war role in liberation. This organization was far more leftist in character, formed by Jichiro Matsumoto, often called the father of Buraku liberation. Much the same as the role he took in Suaheisha, Sakamoto preferred to operate behind the scenes. The organizer of this post-war party was from a totally different part of the country, and Sakamoto's presence gave Matsumoto's Buraku Liberation League some degree of legitimacy. It was obvious by this point that the league was shifting to the left, and a conflict with the old veterans of Suaheisha was brewing, so Sakamoto formed a friendship association. In later decades, he shifted away from the BLL for one reason or another. So why haven't you heard of the burakumin? Japan loves to advertise their traditional history, but a taboo exists around talking about this community. Some even insist the buraku don't exist anymore. One reason is because of a great political fracture after the war. See, post-war politics began simply enough, with a great deal of enthusiasm for the future. On February 19, 1946, representatives of the former Suaheisha met at the newspaper hall in Kyoto City for a press conference. Jichiro Matsumoto was there, the future Liberation League chairman, alongside army veterans, priests, and university professors. In front of a crowd of hundreds of people, they announced they were reforming under a new name, the Buraku Liberation National Committee. The following day, a conference was held in which members of the Progressive Party, the Socialist Party, Liberal Party, and Communist Party all gave speeches. Their position shifted away from that of the Levelers Association, which had been focused on denouncing individual discriminators. Now the Liberation Committee was arguing that discrimination like this could only occur in a capitalist system. So in 1955, they dropped the title committee, saying it was elitist, and then arguing that league was a better name. They were aiming to be a part of a broader struggle to liberate everyone, including the burakumin. From the committee, the league split off. From the league, other splinter groups formed. The National Buraku Liberation Movement Association and its associated Normalization League were claimed by the new BLL to be outlets of the Japanese Communist Party in the 1970s. From this group, the National Federation of Regional Human Rights Movements was established in 2004, arguing that the burakumin were essentially already liberated and that the League was using intimidation for personal gain. Many members of the National Federation were also members of the Communist Party. The All Japan Dawa Association, or Zen Nihon Dawa Kai, was formed in 1960, pulling many members from the Buraku Liberation League. Zen Nihon Dawa Kai sees itself as a successor to the conservative reconciliation movement that the original levelers were created to oppose, but still still aims to liberate the burakumin through their platform of conservative local government. When the All Japan Dawa Association was embroiled in scandals in the 1980s, some members accused them of violent profiteering, breaking away to form the additional rival group Jiyu Dawakai, or the Liberal Dawa Association. Finally, in 1991, the Buraku Liberation League National Federation formed, struggling against the Narita airport and aiming to form a 50,000-strong resistance movement against Japanese imperialism. They advocate for a revolution of the proletariat and speak of reviving the earliest far-left activities of the struggle. I have not enough time or brain cells to talk about all of these groups, so I should stick to Jichiro Matsumoto, the chairman of the Buraku Liberation League. He was born in 1887 in the poor part of Fukuoka City. Unlike many leaders of Zenkoku Suaheisha in Nara Prefecture, he came from an impoverished farming family, although his father was somewhat respected as a member of the village council. Like the leatherworking family of Shichiro Sakamoto, Jichiro's father was involved in the production of leather-soled wooden sandals, acting only as a middleman and arranging sales of the raw materials for the village businesses. After dropping out of high school in Tokyo, he moved to China's Dalian City and gained employment as a fortune teller. The Japanese consulate heard that he presented himself as a doctor, and for this deported him back to Kyushu Island in 1910. It seemed like he had a small fortune because he used his own cash to start Matsumoto Gumi, his very own construction firm. Historians classify this group as a part of the Kyushu Yakuza, one of the most powerful groups on the island. They were fighting for the respect of the locals and to get what they felt they were due. Jichiro Matsumoto became a fixture of the burakumin around Fukuoka. Some years later, just before the Levelers Association was formed, he jumped the gun on denouncing historic discrimination against the burakumin. The year was 1921, and the local government instituted a mandatory donation scheme for the 300th anniversary of Kuroda Nagamasa's death, the first lord of the Fukuoka domain. Lord Kuroda would have cut their Buraku ancestors down and not given it a second thought. Why should they pay to commemorate him? 2 years later, in 1923, he became the chairman of the Kyushu branch of the Levelers Association and took a strong liking to their policy of denouncing historic discrimination. In 1927, for example, he led a movement to demand that Duke Tokugawa relinquish his title, arguing that anti-Buraku sentiment began with the Tokugawa shogunate. Authorities accused him of plotting to assassinate Duke Tokugawa and sentenced him to 4 months in prison. In response, one of his followers burned down the Tokugawa residence. The 1930s were a turbulent time in Japanese politics. In 1936, Jichiro was elected to the House of Representatives and would be seated there 3 times. Soon after election, he stated, quote, "The existence of the aristocracy, who enjoy unjust privileges, is the cause of unfair discrimination against burakumin, and in order to liberate burakumin, the peerage system should be abolished." This was shocking because the February 26th coup had just taken place and most representatives were distancing themselves from the plotters and from the perpetrators. By 1940, he was boycotting the House of Representatives for their actions taken in expelling a speaker for his stance against the war. He and many others were expelled over this, but were soon pushed back into the House of Representatives because of a strange political maneuver. In 1942, many people were recommended back by the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, partly due to the fact that they were barred from holding office elsewhere in their capacity as special representatives, a very clever way to keep them out of local politics during the war, falling short of putting them behind bars. Once the war was over, U.S. shortwave radio reported that in November 1945, Jichiro refused to salute the emperor at a meeting which caused a great commotion. After the Supreme Allied Command occupied Japan, he was barred from holding public office because of his association with the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, but this was soon overturned when his contributions were recognized and acknowledged. In April 1947, he ran for the first regular election of the House of Councilors, and at that time became the chairman of the Buraku Liberation National Committee. He served in the Diet 5 times and became the first vice president of the House of Councilors. He associated closely with the Japan Socialist Party's leftist faction and caused some worry in America's early Cold War that Japan might shift towards the Reds. In fact, he loudly proclaimed he would have been the Speaker of the House of Councilors had he not been Buraku, And if that were the case, Japan may have actually embraced a form of socialism. The Red Purge of the late 1940s pushed him out of government, but he returned to activism and was eventually re-elected. By 1955, he'd widened the scope of the Buraku Liberation Committee, changing the name to the Liberation League and becoming its first executive chairman. In 1964, he was awarded the First-Class Order of the Sacred Treasure, but refused, saying he didn't want the Emperor's medals. Much like how Inahiro Asanuma's death was the final blow for the Japan Socialist Party, Matsumoto's 1966 passing saw the leagues fracturing into those various competing groups. Before we end the history tour, I'd like to take you to some uniquely Buraku places around Kyoto and tell you the story of their own efforts to uplift themselves. A large population lived around the city, and they still do, near the railroad tracks. Here you can find a uniquely preserved old wooden building, the Bank of Yanagihara Memorial Museum. The Yanagihara Bank is the only bank ever created specifically for and run by the Buraku people themselves. The role this bank played for the outcast is impossible to overstate. Most institutions refused to loan money to them, so the opening of this bank meant that the Buraku could send their kids to school, they could go to college, take out loans, and start their own businesses. They could buy a home, better their lives, and improve the community from within. In 1927, the bank closed during a financial crisis, but the building was sold to a family who continued using it as a shop until 1994, when it was finally converted into the first museum for the Buraku people. I was asked not to take photos inside, but encouraged to tell the story. In front of the bank is a monument to Gihi Sakurada and the Emancipation Edict of 1871. With some small amount of upward social mobility and the official abolition of the caste system, Gihi was filled with the hope for the future of his people. He sold all his heirlooms to finance his family's mission to provide for the destitute and the downtrodden. This edict is important because it was followed by a series of forgotten pogroms. While the restoration was welcomed by many, some in the peasantry were furious that they were now legally equal to the burakumin, and filled with rage that they were now on the same footing, uprisings took place in at least 20 villages west of Osaka and Kyoto. Hundreds of homes were burned, many were killed, but numbers were never officially recorded. Their demands were simple: revoke the edict and demand separation of the Buraku. This left columns of people hungry, homeless, and diseased, searching for their children's next meal, begging in the countryside. Men like Gihi Sakurada were the saviors of these disadvantaged souls. In response to the deadly riots and mass exodus of people fleeing violence or seeking to move across the country and change their name to pass as non-Buraku, Gihi opened storehouses and helped to finance a rubber factory, providing work to the poor. Soon after the bank was up and running, Sakurada opened the Yanagihara Elementary School, which the bank helped to support. In 1886, a cholera epidemic devastated Japan, killing upwards of 150,000 people. Sakurada was a worldly man and helped to educate the Buraku on how to prevent the spread of the disease. 3 years later, Kyoto announced the formation of a separate, mostly Buraku town, Tanagiwara. The Burakumin rejoiced because this meant they had a greater role in local government. They had their own mayor, Gihi Sakurada, their own bank, schools, temples, and now a huge rubber factory that brought jobs and respect to eastern Kyoto's outcast. Mayor Sakurada invited German engineers to teach locals about self-sufficiency in the rubber business. Sakurada would pass away in 1893 at the age of 61. In eastern Kyoto, a couple of temples are worth mentioning: Ginkakuji to the north and Nenzenji to the south, about a 35-minute walk from one to the other, lying along the Philosopher's Path. Both are beautiful, but an often overlooked aspect of their construction and maintenance is the specific emancipation of the caste who worked to upkeep the gardens. Stepping back, I should explain that in 1968, the Buraku Liberation League organized the Buraku Liberation and Human Rights Research Institute, or BLHRRI, which has some interesting information on the history of the Burakumin that involves these two temples. To quote them directly, "Such a social formation, as existed in feudal Japan, made the samurai class fear that these people might unite and oppose men of power. Accordingly, the ruling class formed a hierarchy. As a result, these social outcasts were called by the derogatory terms ita, extreme filth, or Heinen, non-human, and were placed at the very bottom of the hierarchy. The BLHRRI explains that there were internal classes within the Buraku people, one of which was called the Senziu Kawaramono, or the Riverbank Gardeners. If you will remember earlier in this video essay, the Levelers Association was pushing back against the Tokugawa family and demanding the Duke, a descendant of the original noble family, relinquish his titles. When he refused, his residence was burned down. About this, Irish socialist and freedom fighter James Connolly said it best: "We will not blame him for the crimes of his ancestors if he relinquishes the royal rights of his ancestors, but as long as he claims their rights by virtue of descent, then, by virtue of descent, he must shoulder the responsibility for their crimes." What were the crimes of the Tokugawa? The shogunate, under their direction, enshrined these social classes in law and formally ended social mobility. Prior to the Edo period and the Tokugawa shogunate, the Riverbank Gardeners commanded a remarkable degree of respect from the upper classes. Prior to the Tokugawa, they were not even allowed to have a last name, but by working in the temples, they were permitted a surname with the suffix "emi." The Ginkakuji and Nanzenji temples have very similar gardens, and the names of two riverbank gardeners with this naming scheme were carved into one of the rocks of Ginkakuji. The riverbank gardeners were respected and appreciated for their unique skills in garden maintenance until their rights were again demoted by the Tokugawa shogunate. This left a generational distaste for the aristocracy among the Buraku people across Japan. For its own unique place in Japanese history, Ginkakuji, with its beautiful gardens maintained and possibly planned by the Burakumin, aimed to emulate the famous Golden Pavilion, Kinkakuji. I'm working hard to find more information on the people who designed this garden, but it's commonly held that Somai prepared the landscape and art. Before his death in 1525, he was a great painter, calligrapher, and landscaper, following in the footsteps of his father, Geimi, and grandfather, Noemi. The latter was a respected art connoisseur from the Ashikaga shogunate, and you're looking now at his work, Lotus. And now at another one of his paintings, Cannon. His son, Geimi, painted Viewing a Waterfall in 1480, regarded as a masterpiece. It was Geimi's son, Soemi, who designed the rock gardens here at the Silver Pavilion, which sports a beautiful sand pyramid representing Mount Fuji. These three masters were known as San Emi, or the Three Amis. The upward social mobility of people like this came to an abrupt halt during the Edo period, thanks to the Tokugawa government. Sen Katayama, who was not Burakumin himself, had much to say about them. In 1924, he published an address to Communist International, the Eida movement, a strong revolutionary factor in the coming struggle for proletarian emancipation in Japan. The Japanese Communist Party still maintains his birthplace here as a monument to this early left-wing activist. The opening of his paper describes much of what I've already said in this video essay, and I'll present it here directly. But remember, Eida is a slur meaning extreme filth. He said, "The Eida class has become a great revolutionary factor in Japan. The public became aware of this during the rice riots of 1918, for the Eida took a prominent part in this uprising in all the large cities. They proved themselves capable of leading unorganized mobs and guiding mass action. In fact, they were the most determined and able of the revolutionary fighters. The rioters, led by the Eida, took possession of and controlled entire cities, such as Kobe, Osaka, and Kyoto, during the rice riots. From these experiences, the Eida became aware that they were in possession of great potential power among the masses. Since then, they have openly declared to the public that they intend to emancipate themselves by their own efforts." Katayama then asserts that the Burakumin are indistinguishable from Japanese people, but are unique in that they're entirely working class. And all of this history is very interesting, but where does this leave us today? The Burakumin Liberation League's BLHRRI has found that the Japanese government recognizes 1.2 million Burakumin in a 1993 survey, living in over 4,400 communities. However, the Liberation League still maintains that there are around 6,000 communities because the government only recognizes so-called Dawa districts, bringing the total number to about 3 million people. Most modern Buraku groups acknowledge the possibility of upward social mobility, but also demand that Japanese society recognize the gap between cultures and address ongoing issues of discrimination, especially common in marriage, police brutality, and employment. An example of the latter are the so-called Buraku lists, emblematic of the struggle they still face. First disclosed in the 1970s, these lists were compiled by private detective agencies as a summary of surnames and locations of Dawa districts. At least 8 types of Buraku lists were written and published in more than 200 sets, marketed at corporations and even prospective marriage partners who wanted to know their significant other's background before tying the knot. To say that the Buraku have been totally liberated is short-sighted. The very topic has been called taboo in Japan, but it's worth addressing for the sake of cultural understanding.